In 1843, Frederick Stanley opened a small forge in New Britain, Connecticut, to make iron door bolts. He powered it with a single-cylinder steam engine shipped up from Brooklyn. The capital was tiny, the factory was a converted armory, and the workforce fit in one room. More than a century and a half later, the company that bore his name would buy Black & Decker for $4.5 billion and become the largest tool company in history. The name on the door stayed Stanley. To understand how that happened, you have to start with the man and the town. Frederick Stanley was born in 1802 in New Britain when the place was still little more than a village. He worked in New Haven and North Carolina, clerked on steamboats, and invested in small manufacturing ventures before coming home. In 1838, he married Melvinia Chamberlain and had 3 sons. Then tragedy hit. Melvinia died of scarlet fever in 1843. 2 of the boys died soon after, and Stanley was left raising his surviving son alone. He never remarried. That same year, he opened the bolt manufactory. The steam engine gave him an edge over nearby shops still relying on hand power or water wheels. Stanley mass-produced bolts, hinges, T-hinges, and chest handles at a price that undercut expensive imports. In 1852, he incorporated the business as the Stanley Works. Sales were modest at first, but the operation grew steadily. The decisive hire came in 1854, when a 19-year-old bookkeeper named William H. Hart joined the factory and never really left. He rose quickly, eventually became president, and ran Stanley for decades. Under Hart, sales climbed, dividends became routine, and the company stabilized. New Britain itself was turning into a manufacturing center, eventually earning the nickname hardware capital of the world. Stanley was the anchor, but it was one of several major firms making the city a machine tool and hardware hub. Frederick Stanley also became a civic builder. He served as the first warden of New Britain and later its first mayor. He helped fund the waterworks, public library, Walnut Hill Park, gas lighting, and rail service. When the first locomotive arrived in New Britain, it carried his name on the side. He died in 1883, but by then the company was already bigger than its founder. The next major chapter came through a cousin, Henry Stanley, who founded Stanley Rule and Level in 1857. While Frederick made the hardware that held buildings together, Henry made the tools used to build them: rules, levels, squares, and plumb bobs. He began acquiring rivals and smaller firms, steadily widening the product line. One of the biggest acquisitions came in 1869 when Stanley bought the patent rights to Leonard Bailey's cast-iron bench plane. Bailey's plane solved a carpenter's old problem. Wooden planes warped with humidity and required constant adjustment. Bailey's cast-iron design was stable, precise, and easier to adjust. Stanley turned it into the famous Bailey bench plane line, numbers 1 through 8. The number 4 smoothing plane and number 5 jack plane became workshop staples across the English-speaking world. Bailey moved to New Britain and earned royalties until a later dispute ended the relationship. Stanley sued, won, and eventually absorbed Bailey's rival line. Later, the company even cast the Bailey name directly into the body of its planes, turning a competitor into part of the brand. Stanley's hand tools became the standard. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, the company had one of the most comprehensive hand tool catalogs in America. It hired inventors such as Eustace Trout, who collected more than 100 patents for squares, levels, plumb bobs, and related tools. That patent depth gave Stanley a moat few competitors could cross. In 1920, Stanley Works absorbed Stanley Rule and Level, combining architectural hardware and hand tools under one roof. Stanley also vertically integrated in unusual ways. It built its own steel strapping plant, bought the Farmington River Power Company to generate electricity, and expanded into Canada and the Northeast. The company was no longer just a Connecticut manufacturer. It was a North American industrial system. One of Stanley's most famous innovations came from an ordinary domestic problem. In 1931, an engineer named Horace Raymond attached a prototype pneumatic door operator to his pantry door at home. Guests saw a hands-free door open while carrying food and immediately understood the value. Stanley patented the system and sold the first commercial installation to a restaurant in Connecticut. The magic door became a global business. Retail stores adopted it, then supermarkets, then commercial buildings around the world. The division later became Stanley Access Technologies and eventually sold for hundreds of millions of dollars. 5 years later, Stanley launched the number 199 utility knife, a replaceable blade knife that became so common in the UK, Australia, and New Zealand that Stanley knife became the generic term for the category. That is what real market dominance looks like. Your brand name becomes the product name. World War II turned Stanley into a military supplier. The company halted civilian production and made belt links for machine gun ammunition, cartridge clips, bullet jackets, bomb casings, and more. Women filled many of the jobs on the factory floor. The steel division earned wartime honors for sustained excellence. Stanley's British operations also contributed to the war effort, making hand tools, shell primers, and tracer components. The war years cemented Stanley's position as a critical industrial supplier. The war also forced the company to think about standardization in a new way. Military contracts demanded parts that could be made in volume, inspected quickly, and shipped without the usual tolerance drift that small shops sometimes accepted. Stanley's factories had to learn to balance speed with repeatability, and that discipline later carried over into peacetime products. The result was a company better prepared than many rivals for the mass market boom that followed. After the war, America built houses, roads, and suburbs. Stanley was there for all of it. The company's annual dividend streak, which had begun in 1877, continued. Sales climbed above $100 million, and the company kept expanding its product line. In 1963, Stanley introduced the PowerLock tape measure. The one-handed locking mechanism let a carpenter extend, lock, measure, and release with a single thumb. The blade used a wear-resistant coating, the case fit the hand, and the tool replaced older, more dangerous spring tapes. The PowerLock became the best-selling measuring tool in history and a fixture on tool belts everywhere. The PowerLock mattered because it changed the feel of a simple task. Measuring no longer required two hands and a second person to hold the end in place. A carpenter could move faster, work solo, and trust the blade to stay put. That sort of small mechanical improvement is often what makes a company memorable. Stanley did not only make tools for factories, it made work feel less clumsy for millions of tradespeople. Under CEO Donald Davis in the 1960s and 1970s, Stanley grew into a much larger company. Employment doubled, sales rose sharply, and new factories opened in Latin America, Canada, France, and West Germany. Davis also pushed Stanley deeper into debt for the first time, using the capital to expand the company's global footprint. The company was now too large to be just a hand tool maker. In the 1980s, Stanley expanded through acquisition. It bought Mac Tools and entered the automotive mechanic market. It bought Bostitch and became a major force in pneumatic nailers and staplers. It acquired Proto and other professional tool brands, building a broad portfolio that reached beyond the consumer DIY aisle. Stanley was becoming an industrial conglomerate. The first serious threat to the company came in 1991, when Newell began buying shares in an apparent takeover attempt. Stanley sued on antitrust grounds, the Connecticut Attorney General joined the fight, and Newell eventually agreed to back away. But the episode exposed a real vulnerability. Stanley had too many brands, too many factories, and margins under pressure from competition. By the mid-1990s, the board wanted a turnaround operator. In 1997, Stanley hired John Trani, a General Electric veteran and Welch protege known for hard cost-cutting. He brought in GE-style efficiency programs, closed plants, shifted manufacturing to Mexico and Asia, and reduced the workforce by thousands. Profits improved, but morale and quality suffered. Then came a reputational crisis even worse than the layoffs. In 2002, Trani proposed moving Stanley's legal headquarters from Connecticut to Bermuda to reduce taxes. The plan sparked outrage from the public, politicians, and workers. Connecticut's Attorney General sued, the SEC looked into voting irregularities, senators moved to punish inversions, and the company's own reputation took a hit. Stanley abandoned the Bermuda plan. Trani retired the following year. Stanley then brought in John Lundgren, an outsider with a packaging and consumer goods background. He looked at the business and saw that basic hardware was becoming a commodity undercut by Chinese producers. His answer was to focus Stanley on higher margin businesses, professional hand tools and storage, commercial electronic security, and engineered fastening. That shift changed the company's center of gravity. Stanley sold off the original residential hardware business, including names tied directly to Frederick Stanley's first products. Kwikset, Weiser, Baldwin, and the Stanley residential hardware line all left the building. In their place came security systems, industrial fastening, and the core professional tool business. When the 2008 financial crisis hit, Stanley was able to absorb the shock because Lundgren had already reduced dependence on big box retail and residential construction. The company still cut jobs and took restructuring charges, but it did not collapse the way some rivals did. That mattered when the next opportunity arrived. In 2009, Stanley announced a merger with Black & Decker. Publicly, it was called a merger of equals. In practice, Stanley controlled the deal. Stanley's CEO stayed in charge. Stanley's ticker survived. Stanley's headquarters stayed in New Britain, and Stanley's name came first. The new company was called Stanley Black & Decker. Black & Decker brought power tools and the DeWalt brand. Stanley brought hand tools, tape measures, storage, security, and engineered fastening. The combination was almost perfectly complementary. The deal closed in 2010 and created a tool giant with billions in revenue. The company now controlled a huge share of the professional and consumer tool world under one roof. The old bolt shop in New Britain had become the apex predator of the global tool industry. That made the brand resilient even when ownership, geography, and business model changed. New Britain remained symbolically important because it linked the modern conglomerate to the original forge, but the company's reach was now global. What had started as a local hardware maker had become a network of brands and technologies spanning consumer, professional, and industrial markets. Its products also lived in ordinary routines. A homeowner reaching for a tape measure, a carpenter locking a blade, or a contractor hanging a door was often using Stanley gear without thinking about the corporate history behind it. That quiet ubiquity was part of the brand's power. It did not need to be noticed to be indispensable. The post-war boom helped cement that position. As suburban construction accelerated, Stanley's hand tools, fasteners, and measuring products sat inside nearly every stage of the home building process. Contractors bought them because they were familiar, dependable, and widely available. Hardware stores stocked them because customers asked for them by name. That feedback loop gave Stanley a rare advantage. The brand did not have to persuade the market that its tools belonged on the truck, because tradespeople had already decided they did. PowerLock is a good example of how small design decisions can become cultural ones. It was not a glamorous product, but it changed a routine that every carpenter knew. The lock, the blade coating, and the ergonomics all reduce friction in daily work. When a tool makes a task feel smoother, it stops being just a measurement device and becomes part of the user's memory of competence. Stanley understood that a job site tool wins by being trusted in motion, not admired on a shelf. The acquisition era in the 1980s sharpened that logic. Mac Tools, Bostitch, and Proto all brought different user communities, and Stanley learned to speak to mechanics, framers, cabinet installers, and industrial maintenance crews in different ways while keeping the same corporate backbone. The company was no longer selling one idea of utility, it was selling a family of solutions for different kinds of work. That breadth insulated it from some market shocks, because weakness in one channel could be offset by strength in another. The leadership changes mattered too. Davis's expansion-heavy era made Stanley bigger, but Trani and Lundgren forced the company to ask which assets actually justified the overhead. That was painful and in some cases destructive, but it also cleared room for the Black & Decker merger to work. The company that emerged in 2010 was not a random pile of brands. It was a deliberately arranged portfolio built around consumer tools, professional tools, storage, security, and fastening. That arrangement made sense because the tool market itself had changed. Big box retail, global sourcing, and the rise of branded professional lines meant that a manufacturer needed scale, distribution, and a trusted name all at once. Stanley had enough history to be familiar, enough brands to cover multiple trades, and enough restructuring behind it to survive another turn in the cycle. In industrial terms, that is a rare combination. The larger arc is the real story. Stanley survived the panic of 1837, the Civil War, 2 world wars, a hostile takeover attempt, a tax inversion fight, and the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. It did so by changing when it had to, shedding what no longer made sense and holding on to the brands and categories that still mattered. The tape measure on your belt, the utility knife in your pouch, the automatic door at the grocery store, the nailer on a framing cruise compressor, all trace back to the same company. The story began with a steam engine in a converted armory and ended with a global corporation that still carries the Stanley name. The founder is long gone, but the tools are still everywhere.